Good afternoon.
Oh.
Today we're going to look at some stained glass and learn about a little bit about, and very briefly, about some of the history of images, also the history of how stained glass got to be, particularly within our own church. So when you look at this image, this is, talk louder, okay, my school teacher voice. when you take, I'd like you all to take a look at this image and then just look at it for a moment and then tell me what you see. What attracts you, or what drew you into, or is drawing you into looking at this image?
The way the light reflects through the such
And the colors
dramatic
themselves.
Colors, yeah. So this is inside the chapel at Mariondale Church, which is a beautiful, very 1965 modern church, but it has the most spectacular stained glass windows. And the colors are rich and intense. And this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the sun just started to shine into the windows. And you see how the light is just reflected and it's coming down. And you start to think about where you are. And you start to think about, this is a really beautiful place to be. But now, what's the difference?
oh,
What's the difference? So this is Todd. Todd was our music director for the Curcio weekend. And as he was standing there just before the service began, the light started to expand. And he had no idea that that was happening. But what do you think about when that light, what can you think about when that light starts to stream through the window? And now just after it being on a wall, an empty wall, what's the difference?
It was looking for a person.
It was looking for a person. And and unbeknownst to him, because he had the gift of music that he was sharing with us. So it was a very special couple of moments, and then the service started, and then it extended to Cindy, and then, which I couldn't take any more pictures, but, the service started. But it was, to me, it was a really brilliant way to really start a service, have the beginning of
And
a
it's
service.
God searching for a person.
It's
not
God searching for a person.
not
And
light.
and it's just perfect the way, came down, and he had no idea until I showed him afterwards. So, you know this, okay? It looks familiar.
Looks familiar.
So every Sunday, when you come in to 8 o'clock, of which the windows are kind of dark, or 10 o'clock, it's the east windows, the sun starts to come up. This is what we see. And this window, I'll give you a brief little history, and then I'll come back to it. But this window was basically the gift of a man called Charles Chauncey Stillman, who was a benefactor to St. John's, who extended the church. He was friends with the priest in charge at that time. And he had asked basically what the priest in charge would have liked, and so since the church was dedicated to St. John's, he asked about doing the life of St. John's here, and so this window is a window that is basically about the life of St. John, done through color and visual imagery that tells a story. And that tells the story of John, the evangelist, the apostle. And it also tells the story of our faith. So we just keep that in mind, and as we kind of go through this. But this window was created in 1926, and it was created by a firm called Powell and Sons, which was earlier known as Whitefriars Glass in London. And it's a very special window because it was done in what's known as the pre-Raphaelite style. There's a lot of nature entwined. So if you look at the bottoms of like the ground and the colors behind, there's a lot of natural elements that add to the backdrop of the piece itself. So we start here. So the idea of imagery, and I'm sure you might have covered this early on, the idea of imagery, I'm just starting like before the Christian era. So these are images from Pompeii. So images have been done on walls for millenniums, but images with people and images where you can look and identify with or tell a story with is something that's mostly started with the Roman era. So what you're looking at is images from Pompeii, and that's anywhere from between the end of the Christian beginning of the Christian era to about the end of the 1st century or the 2nd century. And so these are frescoes that are painted on the wall. They are painted with figural representations that tell a story. And for the most part, since they were Pompeii, for the most part, they tell the story of either gods and goddesses of the Roman religion, but more so, the life of like the aristocrats of Pompeii as well. So you have up in the top there, you have some service kind of going on. You have a lot of little mystical animals, and then the Romans developed. They were very, very skilled because they developed their skill basically from copying the Greeks, who were very, very advanced in creating human images. But you have some wonderful visual images of people, and an acknowledgement of facial forms, knowledge of body forms, and then also doing things. So on the top one there, that's a baker and his wife, and they're basically a local couple that took care of the aristocrats in their cooking needs. But look at the recognition of the faces, and as well as you get a sense of who they are, and very, very naturalized. And then below there's a noble woman playing a lyre, some kind of a harp, and then Sappho, and she's an educated woman with a book in her hand and a pen in her hand, and she's writing. So these images, and there were quite a few, all throughout the Roman Empire, were the predecessors of the early Christian representations in the catacombs, particularly in Rome. And the catacombs were a series of underground, basically tunnels, where the Christians who could not openly practice their faith until in the end of the 4th century, middle or end of the 4th century, took to the underground burial places, and they created what they knew, and what they knew was visual imagery, frescoes. And what a fresco is you have masonry, however the building or in the building or the catacomb is built, you have masonry. It's either stone or some kind of a brick or some kind of a solid structure, and then a plaster combination is added to the walls, is kind of placed on the walls, and then the images basically are painted on the walls with a water and pigment configuration, and the water and pigment more or less align with the chemicals in the plaster, and it creates a bond. However, because the catacombs are underground, they kind of, water is a detriment to plaster, so that even though they're mostly in good shape, many of them have just fallen apart. But it's the Christian imagery that's being portrayed, the life of Christ, the imagery of Christ and his apostles, the Last Supper, these early stories that these early Christians had begun to listen to by the gospel writers. So it was listening to the word, and then creating visual imagery in order to enunciate the word, so that the people, the populace who were really basically uneducated, could understand what the word was all about. And it was a reflection of the stories of the life of Christ, particularly the life of the saints, and living a good life, and done in the Roman style, because they were products of Rome, and they existed in that environment. So. What's also very interesting is some of them had words written on, and so what you're looking at is very early Roman capital script. So we get our alphabet from the Romans, and they basically started their letter forms on tombs and sculptural tombs, and then when they started translating them onto surfaces or into documents, they just basically copied the letters. So what they're doing is they're telling a story, and they're telling a story. The reading, this idea of reading, would only have been to a select few, because people were basically uneducated. So this is up until about the 5th century, 4th and 5th century, and with Constantine and the awareness of the Christian church and the open practicing of Christianity, all of the services were taking place underground. So the earliest, for about 800 or 900 years, many of the earliest churches or chapels were built fairly small, and they're very, very private. As wealth started to grow, particularly in England and in France, the chapels very often were private chapels. And so the chapels, this is the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. A wealthy person would have designated that a chapel be built, and that they would also have the leading artist of the day decorate the chapel. So this is a chapel by, Scrovegni, but Giotto, the artist Giotto, created the life cycle of Christ on the interior of the chapel there as well. And so basically, again, it's a story. It's a fairly what the word is. It kind of goes in order, about Christ, and then the miracles and all of that, But it's a story on the wall. Just before that, and this is also, the understanding, because you need to see this, you'll see why. The understanding of the importance that Giotto played in the development of art, because up until this time, human form was really, during the 700s and 800s, the human form had kind of broke away from that naturalized form of early Rome and became very primitive. And here Giotto is now, it's about 1200. Giotto is taking the human form and really humanizing the human form, as well as humanizing the tasks of the life story of Christ. There's some of the other images there. They tell a story, but basically it's what, for the most part, it's the life cycle of the New Testament. So the images would then relate to, the lessons that were being taught in the, within the service. And that's number one. Number two, the chapels themselves. Now, Patty, when she talked about the cathedral and the development of the cathedral. So these buildings, up until and by the 1200, for the most part, were very austere. They were very plain. They had very little sources of light. So it just was a structure on the outside. And there's a reason, because you as a mortal, as an individual, you are leading an earthly life outside the chapel. And it wasn't until you went into the chapel that you saw the glory of God. And that really mostly carried through until, the Renaissance era. But these early chapels are pure. They're really pure because they dealt with the spirituality and the life, the life themselves there. This is Fontenay Abbey, and again, you see how limited the structure is. Very, very plain. And since it's a Cistercian abbey, there's no decoration on the inside. Patty was also mentioning about how the development of the Romanesque, the early churches in the Romanesque arch, and then eventually to the Gothic arch. Well, these early churches, they're very, very heavy. There's a lot of stone. There's not a lot of natural light going into the chapel itself. So the natural light has a limited amount of sources that allows the light in. So you have to imagine the insides would be fairly dark except for candlelight. Since it was an abbey, and it had the long nave, and it has some of the windows at the east end and then the west end, there was no decoration, because as monks, you didn't, you were providing for your own community. But as it grew, the abbey itself grew. This is 12th century. As the abbey itself grew, the size of the abbey, the pilgrims started coming in, and so there was more exposure to the abbey itself. But it also had a cloister, and that's over on the right-hand side. And you see, there's no decoration. Any decoration would have been on the tops of the capitals of the columns there as well. But again, you leave your earthly body outside, and then you enter into the sanctuary. And then we get to this transition between the Romanesque church and the Gothic church. And it all starts with William the Conqueror. Now, William the Conqueror, you know who he is, right? In 1066, he took a little trip across the English Channel, which wasn't the English Channel at that time, and then more or less conquered England. In his home country, in the city of Caen, he had a church dedicated to St. Stephen. He initiated the building of the Church of St. Stephen, which is called the Abbey to the Men, or the Abbey for the Men. And then his wife, a few years later, this is all in the 11th century, had designated then a church would be dedicated. It's called Santa Trinita, or the Church of the Women. Now, why do you think that would be? It's a very simple reason. Because up until this time, any of the churches, or any of the larger churches, men could only stand in the nave. And the women were designated to be in these little alleys up at the top, up there as well. So there would be no chairs, so they would be standing in the services. But that's Romanesque. But you see how the arches are starting to point up. So the Church of the Men, Saint Etienne, was basically a church for the men, but started started with, again, this very, very plain, simple structure on the outside. Something that I don't know that Patty mentioned, and you might know, you might not know. You know the Roman arch? You know the Roman arch basically has one arch. But then the Constantine arch and the Augustan arches have two side arches. Do you know that? Okay. The main arch, if you picture a main arch would be where the ruler would go, and then the slaves on one side and the soldiers on the other. So there was always three entrances, or three holes, or three openings. And that then got translated into Christian architecture. So you have the largest arch, which then corresponds with the nave, and then you have the two side arches. And if it still works today, particularly like with Catholic churches in the Jubilee year, if you go down to St. Patrick's, the only time that door, the central door is open on the Jubilee year. So it's a special thing. But that all comes from the Roman arch. So that Romanesque, that Roman arch is then started to configure to create a larger structure. But now with the Church of the Dom, or the Church Santa Trinita, look at the difference on the inside. Because what was happening, and these were changes in architectural building, is that with the philosophy of structural building, the churches were getting taller. And as they were getting taller, there's no need to have the women celebrate up in these little alleys over there. And so the nave was wider, the aisles were wider, and so they were able to, able to increase the size of the height of the architecture itself. The other thing you should know is that William the Conqueror, after he died, he was in Rouen. After he died, he was brought back to Caen and buried. It's his tomb over there, and buried in the church. So these two churches themselves were in the history of church building, were basically the crux of the beginnings of the Gothic era. And it was the beginnings of letting, the structures were getting higher. They weren't so confined and tall and bulky, but they were getting higher and they were getting lighter. And if you look at the two fronts, they were started about 20 years difference in each other. But even if you look at the fronts, particularly this part of the front there, you'll see how the weight is lightened up, because you have more openings in space. To let the light in. And the light, by the way, is called clerestory. And in the back of the church, where you have the apse and you have all of the nave and then all of the transepts and all of that, you have a lot more structure, because these became pilgrimage churches. You have a lot more structure for pilgrims to come in one end, go around the back, and come out the other. Okay, so it was a multi-purpose. But in the history of church building, this idea of creating more area, heightened area, they needed to be able to support the walls. And so with that, then, we had, again, in the 12th century, we had the beginnings of a church that was dedicated to Saint Denis, Saint-Denis, again, about the same time, a little bit later, than the Caen churches. But you see the structure is it's a little bit more decorative. The structure is fairly similar, right? But this was taking the architecture a little further. There had been a church or a place of worship on the site since about the 3rd century, dedicated to the miracles and the martyrdom of Saint Denis. And this church, it was probably about the 3rd iteration of the church that would be built on this. So then it was going to be more substantial. You notice that picture was taken. That's a drawing that was done in the end of the 19th century. The tower collapsed, so that's why it looks like one tower. But it had always been, in its history, it had always been a burial ground for the kings and the royal family, and then the bishops within Paris itself. So the movement along the architectural structural movement along that is that as the churches get higher and the walls were going higher, you had a greater opportunity to let light in, not only in the front, but along the side walls. And as along the side walls there, you needed to support the walls. And so this idea of buttressing developed. Can you see the buttresses there? Mm-hmm. Buttressing developed. And then you had what's called a flying buttress. So that really allowed the walls of the structure to go higher and higher up there as well. So because of that, it's like fingers, just think of fingers. The fingers are holding up the walls of the church. And because of that, then they could open up the walls of the church to let light in. So now going from these big, heavy, bulky structures, they moved to a lighter structure, a structure that had more, more height. It was the fingers of God. That's how they looked at it. The fingers of God were reaching towards the heaven. And so here you have Saint Denis. It's been cleaned up, and here you have Saint Denis. And there was a very well noted abbot that was part of the order there, and his name was Abbot Suger. And Abbot Suger was the abbot to the kings, and was the abbot to all the high priests and all of that. And he had gotten the commission to extend Saint Denis. And so in the extension of the nave and the heights and all of that, he then started to commission stained glass. And it was with this church basically that this whole philosophy of glass filling in the spaces, these empty spaces that were now created from the churches going higher. It was the idea of filling in with color and light. And you see the nave there as well. So the naves are extended. It's broadened out a little bit further. The arches on the inside, those heavy Romanesque arches, they're starting to point up. And that, as Patty was explaining, that idea of a pointed arch takes the thrust of the weight of the top of the church and extends it down so the church wouldn't fall down. And so, but it was this idea of light, and the light that came into the church through the windows then became very holy. Okay? So stained glass, just a little bit of history about stained glass. Here's a couple of images about the making of stained glass. So there's a lot of, even though it goes over over many decades of building, there's a lot of work that goes into the design and the structure of the church itself. And so you have the design, the working of the dimensions of the church, and then you have the glaziers. And the glaziers would be the one that needed to fill these spaces with some type of surface area. And in order to let the light in, they weren't going to do full panel sheets that were 20 feet tall. They started to break down. Let me just go one further. Nope, I'm not going to do that. Oh yeah, it's up in the top. Yeah, it's up in the top right-hand corner.
Oh.
So that some of the earliest glass was monochromatic. It was very simple color. But how a stained glass window is created is you start with a design, and that design is called a cartoon. And then you have these craftsmen then that translate the cartoon to the full size that you're going to need. And then you work with a glazier. A glazier is someone who's going to actually do the cutting of the glass and the fitting of the glass into these lead channels. And the lead channel is, it looks like a U, and the glass fits in like that. And it's very moldable. So then that whole piece then would be designed to fit the specific window that it was going into. So it was a process, but again, that was a very laborious type of process. But it was a process that really filled the spaces. And so with the glass, the early stained glass, it was made with silica and potash and some kind of chemicals. And then a non-organic colorant would be added to give it the color, and then fired at a fairly high temperature. There was also other glass, and you also have the stained glass aspect here, but you also have the painted glass. So that would be, painting of a chemical on the glass, and then that would get fired in. So you don't just have the solid color elements, but you also have the painting in order to give it some kind of reality. So you have the grisé, which is very simple light color, but in a pattern or design, and then you have the color in the glass there as well. So some of the colors that started to be used, and here this is Abbot Suger, and this glass dates from the 12th century. And there's Abbot Suger, who is rebuilding the church. You see, he's working with the church. There he is, he's doing the dedicated, doing a dedication over there. And there he is over there. He's lying at, the foot of the Virgin Mary. Okay, so they told a story, and they told the story as best as they could through visual images. The other thing that's interesting about them is the use of color and actually how they could get the color, fire the color, so the color would still remain with the color of the glass. And there were certain colors that were very common, and you could see the colors that are running through. So red, when they used red, the symbolization was passion, love, energy, and power. When they used blue, notice there's a lot of blue in the background there, heaven, loyalty, truth, and wisdom. When they used green, and some kind of green for the most part, it would be fertility, rebirth. Purple would be royalty, luxury, and that would primarily be shown in their garments. And then gold would be wealth and prosperity. So there was a whole color system that was going on. You know, it wasn't in these early days in the 12th century, it wasn't like a real science as far as, you know, the images that we saw that were fairly realistic with Giotto and in Italy. The images to be translated into glass kind of moved a little bit backwards, but you still were able to tell the story there as well. And then these are some of the other windows. It's about the life of Saint Benedict. And you get to see that in these center medallions is the life, the story being told. And then the side medallions would have been like little supplementary additions, and then all with the decorative border. But so you see some of the windows actually have words. I call them talking windows or talking images, you know. But you know, you have to imagine that if they're 40 feet above where you're sitting, you're not going to see them. So, but you know, they're there. But you see how the coloration kind of works together, and it just becomes a whole exercise in dedication. But it was all about the light and how the light streamed in. That's the apse, and that's, you know, then the end of the church, and that light there. And it was Abbot Suger who said it was the fingers of God coming through the windows in the light to touch your soul and create the divine. So, you know, that started that thought process there as well. You notice in that rose window there, that has 12 sections for the 12 apostles. There was a lot of symbolism, not only in the images that were in the stories that were being told, but also the layout of the images as well. And it was all about the light. So you see, you know, those fresco churches, or the churches with the very hard walls, and the Romanesque era, the very hard. All of a sudden you walk in and you're bathed in light, and you're bathed in spirituality, you're bathed in divinity there. So it really became a thing of beauty, of glory. So this is the Church of Saint-Chapelle. Now, Saint-Chapelle was a royal chapel, it was a private chapel. But that too, you know, when you say stained glass, everybody says, oh, Saint-Chapelle. But it's a private chapel. But it's just, there's hardly any walls in the church itself. And you see between the reds and the blues and some of the yellows, but the colors, how they just reflect, you know, the sun, and then come, you know, more or less stream into the church. And again, with medieval, you know, the story of Christ, the story of the saints, you know, all of that. But you see on the outside edge, you see these little buttressing things in order for the structure to create a height. And this is, what is this? Oh, this is Canterbury Cathedral. And Canterbury Cathedral was started in the 11th century, extended over, you know, a couple of centuries, and they too, devised, the visual imagery and symbolism of, the Christian faith, and then incorporated them, like that's the Last Supper there, incorporated them into the images in the rondels, particularly, so that you would be able to understand and tell the story, particularly of the New Testament. And again, you see the same colors, the reds and the blues, and very, very bright, very strong, strong coloration. A few years ago, they were doing some restoration in Canterbury, and they brought several of the windows over here, I think they're in the Metropolitan, so that they could work on some of the spaces there. But again, you see, even with church building, even though the church itself, the cathedral itself, had its beginnings in the 11th century, it's still being worked on, it's still being created, but it's that initial structure with the light, this idea of light coming through in order to give the grace of God through visual images. And again, it's all about the light. So these figures date back to the 12th century, and these are a little bit more decorative and heraldic. But you could see the images, and then their names, their saint names are given within the images themselves there as well. But again, you see the colors, the reds, the blues, the yellows, the greens, and how they carry through. So, so that's that. And then we come to St. Thomas Church in New York City. So St. Thomas Church is, again, it's a third or fourth reiteration from the original church. St. Thomas is in Midtown on Fifth Avenue. And actually, this structure is early 20th century, but it was built in the style of a Gothic church. And the Gothic church, the rear address in the back is filled with sculptures and, but that too, the important part about that is that it recreated, just like St. Patrick's Church, it recreated this idea of a Gothic church. Tall structures, a lot of light source going in, a very traditional structure. But one of the fascinating facts about St. Thomas Church is that the windows in the 1920s were commissioned by the church, the church fathers, by James Powell and Son, which is Whitefriars. So their windows are the same as our windows. A little bit more complicated, but their windows, and they're very ornate. They're very complicated to that effect, and they fit within the opening there as well. So so that's an interesting type of thing. And then we get to St. John's. And within St. John's, our church window there, when it was commissioned to be able to tell the story of the life of St. John. And through various images itself. You can't get up there, but I did. When off to the right corner, the logo, which they don't do anymore, there is a logo sitting right here on the ledge in the window here that's about that big, and it's a White Friar, and that is signifying the Whitefriars Glass Company as well. So the stories of the life of St. John, they're broken down into categories, and so you see up close and personal, you see St. John writing his gospel, writing his revelations. You see the eagle. Right, you see the eagle that is, the symbol of St. John, as like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You also see his location. He lived and worked in Patmos, and then you begin to see some of the events that happened within John's life, and his spirituality, as well as come follow me. I will make you a fisher of men, and then the pure love of John. That is, regarding Christ as his Lord. And then finally to Christ itself, okay? So with that, we're gonna go into the church.
Field trip.